What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. I was not expecting this when I woke up this morning, but it's not 80 degrees, but 30 degrees was a bit of an extreme change in temperature. But nevertheless, you know that nothing stops me from getting out in the garden. So we're out in the garden today, we're planting potatoes, and I'm really excited to bring you guys along because a lot of you love when we plant potatoes, but a lot of you write in saying, you know, my potato yields were kind of mediocre, and I was really wondering if you could outline all the things you do to guarantee huge yields. And so I thought, why not make that today's episode? So not only are we planting potatoes, but I'm gonna go through step by step everything that we do to making sure that we have the largest yields possible. Let's go. All right, so the first thing to getting huge potato yields has everything to do with the soil. Now, what you'll notice I'm doing is I'm doing a process called double digging. This is where I dig in and I lift the soil up and I just give it a gentle flip and I kind of just chop it up. And what that's doing is it's really loosening the soil. Now, we grow in pure compost. We've grown in pure compost for 5-6 years, ever since we started this garden. And the soil quality is very, very good. In fact, I think it's some of the best soil we've ever had because we're constantly building it and it's constantly getting better. But one thing that we make a practice of doing is we make a practice of loosening the soil in the beginning of the season. And the reason why is because even though we have really good soil, we get a kind of a compacted top layer. It's about an inch or two deep, and that's called a cake layer. And we talk about this a lot, how when you're planting root crops or tuber crops, things like it could be onions, it could be garlic, it could be potatoes, you want to really break that up to loosen it up. And so even though we have compost, we're still double digging our beds. Now, you guys know we practice a method called no-till gardening. That's basically where we leave the beds as minimally disturbed as possible so that nature can do all the rototilling and do what nature does best. But when it comes to potatoes, I do find that double digging my beds is a must. And that's because the second part to the soil is you want nice, deep, loose soil. You see, our beds here are about 12 inches off the ground, and granted, they're not filled 100% up the way, so that you're talking maybe 10 inches, 9 inches of beautiful soil. And it's really important that you have a minimum to grow potatoes well of 8 inches of loose soil. Any less than 8 inches, if it was like 6 or 7 inches of soil, you're really going to struggle growing deep, large potatoes. And that's because potatoes like to send their roots down. And if you've ever harvested a potato and you pull it up and there's like 2 or 3 potatoes really close to the plant, that's because the potato was not able to send its roots down deep. And that's where, at the end of the root fibers, that's where the future potatoes will form. So if you find that your potatoes are really close to the plant where you planted it originally, try loosening the soil so it can go deeper, send those roots deeper and further out, and you're gonna end up with a lot more potatoes just doing that alone. All right, now the next secret to getting huge potato yields is the time that you plant. Now you'll notice that I'm out here in the garden and it's 30 degrees out. Now, in mid-April, we still have many more days of a threat of frost. And that's because we want to plant our potatoes about 2 to 3 weeks before our last frost date. And that's before our last frost date. Because when you plant your potatoes, they're going to sit in the ground, they're going to get established, they're going to generate roots before they start to grow. And it's super important that we get our potatoes established because they take a long time to actually get growing and get mature. We're not actually going to probably see the potato sprouts for another, I'd say about 3 to 4 weeks. And so when the soil is cool like this, the plants will grow slower and it makes them actually kind of get established a little bit better. If you plant potatoes in really warm soil, what you'll find is the plants grow really fast, but that really fast development actually leads to poor root development, which is what the potatoes are going to form on later. And since potato plants will form roots first and growth second, getting those roots established is key and very critical to getting huge yields. Now, the third tip to getting huge potato yields has everything to do with your seed stock. Whether you're going with something you buy online, something you get at a hardware store, or even something you've saved yourself, having really good seed stock is super important. Now that's because the potatoes are a tuber and the energy that's found in the tuber is going to provide the next year's growth. And so that's this year, right? So last year, the potatoes formed. They were put into storage, and then when they're pulled out of storage, that's the second year. And so it's super important that you find potatoes from a reputable source that are not only going to be disease-free, that are going to be high quality and not too shriveled. You want to find potatoes that they will look a little bit raisiny because they've been sitting in storage for like 6-7 months, but you want to find potatoes that still have a good amount of firmness to them, even though they're going to look a little raisiny, because that is the energy that's going to form these future eyes here. Now, these eyes are really well developed. They look incredible. And that's kind of the next thing about high quality seed potatoes that you're looking for is you don't want the eyes to be too long. The eyes that are short and just starting to develop are the best ones to plant in the ground. And the reason why is because if they get too long, it's a lot like leggy seedlings. Leggy seedlings is a sign of a stressed seedling. And you want a seedling that is nice and stout. And you can think of these as seedlings. All right, now part 3.5 to how to get huge potato yields, because this still has to do with seed potatoes, is going with varieties that are known to do well in your area. Now, different potatoes will perform differently in different areas, obviously, and so it's really important to do your research or just kind of trial out a bunch of different varieties and see which ones consistently perform for you. Now, that's kind of what we did to kind of come up with our 3 favorites, and our 3 favorites are going to be different from your 3 favorites. You might have 1 or 2 that are the same, but I doubt that unless you're growing right next door to me, your 3 favorites are going to be the same as mine. And that's because my soil is different than your soil. My weather conditions are different than your weather conditions. And those differences definitely play a huge role into the yields that you're going to get. Now, I have found that throughout the years, these 3 perform the best for me, and these might be a good start for you. So these are the Red Norland. They're a beautiful red skin potato. A lot of you have gone with Pontiac Red. Pontiac Red is a slight variation of a Red Norland. I find that they don't do quite as well in like the later summer when it gets humid. I find that they get a little bit prone to things like scab, which we'll talk about in a second. That's a pH imbalance in the soil. They're a little more prone to scab, and they're also a little more prone to late blight in our area. So that's why I find the Red Norland is a little bit hardier and performs a little bit better. We also have the Kennebec. Now, the Kennebec is a huge potato. These things get like the size of a football. I mean, they're absolutely massive. And so we go with those, not only because they are super delicious, but they're really hardy in our area. And then we also have, this is the Russet Norcota. Now, any Russet variety does really, really well for us. So I find that any variation of a Russet will be fine planting. So I always stick to these 3 varieties. I don't stray too much from them. I've tried something like Purple Majesty before. It's a purple potato, and they produce really well, but we just find that we don't eat them quite as much as these 3 here. So that's why not only are we going to eat, not only are we going to grow what we're going to eat more of, but we're also growing varieties that are going to produce well for us in our area. Now, speaking of great varieties that grow well in your area, I find the best way to find a new variety that I've never grown before is to ask a local farmer. Local farmers typically have the most knowledge about a variety that's going to grow well in your area. And I bet that you could find a local farmer that's selling seed potatoes on the app Farmish, the sponsor of today's episode. Farmish is an app that connects both buyers and sellers of locally grown agricultural products. So whether you're growing potatoes to sell or you're someone that wants to buy potatoes, you can find those products over on Farmish. Now, I've been using Farmish for about a year and a half or so, and I absolutely love it because of the fact that, yes, it's a global app and you can see what people are growing and selling all over the country, but you can also connect with local farmers. And here at MIgardener, we have a heartbeat for local, and we want to support our local farmers. And so if you're interested in checking out Farmish, you can go check it out for free over at getfarmish.com/MIgardener. And if you're interested in selling something, you can sell up to 3 different products for free, no charge ever. If you're interested in more than that, though, you can actually purchase a market membership, which is $29 a month or $299 a year. And if you want to buy something like locally grown seed potatoes, you can do that for free forever. There's no charge if you want to go on there and just support your local farmer. So I want to thank Farmish for sponsoring today's episode, and let's get back to planting potatoes. All right, the 4th step to getting huge potato yields is by digging a trench. Now, we're going to be digging a trench to plant our potatoes directly in. And the point of digging a trench here is basically to make sure that the soil quality that's inside of the trench where the potatoes are going to be growing and forming future potatoes is as rich and as loose as possible. Now, the thing is that oftentimes people dig a trench that is either way too wide and is unnecessarily wide, or way too deep and is unnecessarily deep. I don't like to work any harder than I have to, and I don't want to disturb the soil any more than I have to. And so the trench that I'm digging here is going to be about 8 to 10 inches wide by about 8 to 10 inches deep. No more than that. It's really not necessary to go any wider or deeper than that. And that's going to ensure that I have a nice wide trench that's going to basically accommodate the potato growth throughout the whole season. And that trench is where those potatoes are going to grow and form. And what it's going to do is it's going to really allow those roots to move throughout the soil. And those, again, those roots are where the potatoes are going to form. Step 5 to making sure you have huge potato yields is amending the trench. Now, what we want to do, because we already have beautiful quality soil, is we simply want to amend the trench to give it more fertility and more nutrients, which are going to help to increase plant growth and future yields. So the first thing that we're adding to this trench is alfalfa pellets. Now, alfalfa pellets are very high in nitrogen, and what that's going to do is it's going to encourage more growth, but it's also going to break down slowly. Things like worms and other soil microbes are going to come in to break down that alfalfa. In the process, they're going to be amending the soil, it's going to keep the soil nice and loose, and it's going to be providing tons of nitrogen, which fuels plant growth. So I put about 3 or 4 good size handfuls into this trench here. And then the next soil amendment we're going to add is granulated sulfur. Now we're going to add in this trench here about a good cup or so of granulated sulfur. And what that does is it actually makes the soil more acidic. So the reason why we want to add things like granulated sulfur to our soil to make the soil more acidic is because of the fact that it prevents scab. Now, scab is not necessarily going to make the potato inedible, but it dramatically cuts down on the shelf life of the potato. And so whereas a potato without scab can last 5 to 6 months, no problem, potato with scab only will last about a month or 2 before it starts to go bad. Now, scab is a bacterial disease that's spread by the bacteria Streptomyces, and Streptomyces does not survive in soil that is fairly acidic. And so basically all we're doing is we are raising the acidity, or lowering the pH, increasing the acidity of the soil so that the bacteria Streptomyces cannot really survive and thrive in the soil. And then in the process, it's going to really allow the potatoes to uptake nutrients better, which they're going to be less stressed, they're going to have more growth and less bacterial problems from those nasty pests. Now I know what you're probably thinking. Where's the fertilizer? Well, there is no fertilizer right now, and we're not going to be adding fertilizer right now, and that's because we're going to be top dressing with fertilizer later. The reason why is because a lot of people make the mistake of fertilizing the hole where the potatoes are going to be growing. And that seems great. However, root's job is to go out and find nutrients. And so if you're fertilizing right at the source, the roots are not encouraged to move throughout the soil. And so it's really important that we top dress with fertilizer so that the fertilizer can move throughout the soil as it rains, as you water, and that's going to encourage roots to move throughout to go find the nutrients rather than being right at the source. Now, the only nutrient source we're providing is this slow release nitrogen source of alfalfa. And that's because the nutrients found in alfalfa are going to take a while to start breaking down. And by the time they're broken down by things like worms and other soil bacteria, the roots will have spread far beyond the point of this alfalfa here. But it's going to provide that prolonged feeding of nitrogen that's going to encourage that growth, encourage the leafy green production, and then the leafy green production is going to generate energy from the sun and store that energy down into tubers. So once we have our soil amendments here, we're going to simply just take it, kind of loosen it up, or kind of mix it up a little bit so it's not just hyper concentrated right there. And then we're going to take our potatoes. Now, if they're super big like this, a lot of times I recommend cutting them because it's just a lot of unnecessary potato. However, because we're getting a tad bit of a late start to planting, we should have planted last week. It's just last week we had so many other jobs to do that I said, all right, well, you know what? I'm kind of kicking the can down the road. So I'm just going to take these. Best practice would be to cut off some of this about a week in advance. We have a video on how we do that to cut off some of this. I'm still going to plant it in the ground, and it shouldn't affect yields too much. Now, when you're planting your potatoes, make sure you're planting them with these sprouts facing up. It's a common mistake to plant them down. Now, eventually the sprouts will find their way up. However, it's just way easier for them to just grow straight up. And then you're going to end up with a far more kind of healthy seedling in the long run because it's not spending all that energy growing down first and then realizing, whoop, I got to do a U-turn. So we're going to take our potatoes face side up, and you'll notice we're spacing these potatoes out. Each row is spaced out about 1 foot to 1 foot and kind of 4 inches or so. because ultimately what we're gonna do is we're gonna space them out roughly about a foot or so, and then each potato is gonna be spaced out about a foot or so as well. So we're gonna get 4 plants in a row, and our rows are gonna be spaced out about a foot as well. And that's gonna give us really good spacing so that as the roots grow out, they're not gonna be conflicting for things like nutrients, soil space, water, and whatnot. They're gonna basically be able to grow and thrive right where they're planted. All right, now the final step to getting huge potato yields comes to hilling. Now, a lot of you ask me, does hilling actually produce larger potato yields? And the answer that you're probably gonna not wanna hear is that no, it doesn't. Now, if you've been hilling your potatoes for years, you're probably convinced that hilling them has given you larger yields, when in fact, hilling them only does one thing and one thing only, and that's to protect them from the sun. If potatoes are exposed to the sun, they produce a chemical called solanine, and that's where potatoes will turn green. And green potatoes are not edible. You shouldn't be eating green potatoes because solanine actually has arsenic in it, which is not great to be eating. And so it's super important to keep your potatoes out of the sun. And that's why people recommend hilling. But there's a common misconception that when you hill your potatoes, the potato stem will form new roots, much like a tomato will. And just because they're in the Solanense family, the nightshade family, tomatoes and potatoes are not alike. Potatoes will not set down roots all along the stem, contrary to popular belief. I know a lot of you have sent in questions about potato towers. And well, if this person can grow 70 pounds of potatoes by putting them in a trash can, why are you putting, your potatoes in a raised bed? You'd grow so much more by simply just putting them in, in a trash can and letting them grow that way. And the answer is because the trash can method it never really worked to begin with. And if you doubt me, try it. You'll come back and realize that I'm very honest in what I say because I want you guys to know the real ways to grow lots more food. And the real way is by simply planting them deep, amending the soil like we talked about, and doing the steps that I talked about in today's episode, because in doing that, you're gonna be actually growing more potatoes. So hilling only basically keeps them out of the sunlight, keeps them from turning green. And then what we're gonna do is, because they're already in a trench, we're going to be basically doing the inverse or the opposite of hilling, right? We're reverse hilling by putting them in the trench deeper. And then when we put the soil over top, it's gonna be flat. And they're gonna be 8 inches deep already. So no need to hill. Now, the only time you'd have to hill is if you start to have your potatoes pop up through the soil. And the reason why they would start to pop up through the soil is because they're not deep enough, or the soil itself is forcing the roots to come up because they can't go deeper. And that's why I really stressed working the soil, keeping it nice and loose, because if it's nice and loose, the roots are not going to be encouraged to go up, they're going to be encouraged to go down, and that's why your potatoes are going to be found deeper rather than shallower in the soil. And then the final thing that's going to protect our potatoes from getting sunlight is the fact that we're spacing them out so close together, close enough to where they're going to shade the soil. Not so close to where they're going to be competing for space and nutrients and stuff like that, but just close enough to where the foliage is going to cover up the soil and should help shade the soil from any sunlight. So there you go. There is everything I know about growing huge yields of potatoes. Maybe one more thing that I'd kind of throw in here, aside from that, is obviously keeping the potatoes well watered. A lot of you kind of like to just plant your garden and walk away. With potatoes, you're gonna find better yields from watering, but that's kind of an obvious one. So make sure you water your potatoes, keep them well watered, and with those tips, I think you should be well off to growing a ton of potatoes this year. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll catch you all on the next episode. As always, grow bigger.